An appeals court panel overruled a lower court judge, allowing the Justice Department to resume using classified documents seized at Mar-a-Lago, while the former president offered a novel theory in a sit-down with Fox's Sean Hannity. And New York's Democratic Attorney General was both praised and pilloried by the pundits as she announced a civil suit against the Trumps, their company, and his adult children, using her platform to accuse them of crimes that she can't prosecute. Joining us now to analyze the coverage, Molly Hemingway, editor-in-chief of The Federalist. And in Los Angeles, Leslie Marshall, the radio talk show host. Both are Fox News contributors. Molly, the Letitia James civil suit in New York, obviously she's a very partisan Democrat, but the media pounced on perhaps her clearest example, which is that Donald Trump claimed his Trump Tower triplex apartment was 30,000 square feet when it's actually about 11,000 square feet.
Well, first off, I just want to say I'm so glad that you showed what happened in the coverage this week, where we have a looming problem globally of a potential nuclear war breaking out, and even that wasn't enough to keep media from moving quickly to this very politicized lawsuit from a very politicized person who, as you know, we see in the coverage, did promise that she would go after President Trump. Rather than talk about the play-by-play on these lawsuits, I think it's also important that the media think about the bigger issues in play. Right now we have quite a few examples of Democrats in political power using their power to essentially try to jail Republicans. This goes very strongly against our notion of rule of law and how things should work, where you don't start with the person that you're trying to go after and then figure out a crime, but instead, you know, in rule of law, you start with any potential crime and you investigate it in a dispassionate manner.
Leslie, Trump called Letitia James a raging maniac at a weekend rally. What I think has been largely overlooked in the coverage is this. The reason Tish James can only bring a civil suit is that a parallel investigation by the Manhattan DA was closed without bringing any criminal charges. And yet she stands up there and uses the presser to say he's violated these federal laws, he's violated these state laws, but it's a civil suit, which, by the way, will drag on in court for a long time.
You're accurate, but I don't think that you just remain silent after an investigation that spans 10 years and your climax is 200 pages of details of broken laws. And even though, yes, it's easier to go after somebody in a civil manner, I think, if anything, this, people say it's political. It doesn't prevent Donald Trump from running or from being president if he were elected. And it certainly is, I think, a spotlight to the, district attorney's office, whether there was a Republican or a Democratic president, because you're looking at the past decade. So if somebody says, look, we've had this investigation, now here are our findings, we will be going forward with a civil suit based on these findings, I think the press conference was warranted. And for people to say, certainly we know her political leanings, but Donald Trump doesn't get punished for this politically. He gets punished in the pocketbook if she is successful. Well,
this, yes, could hurt his company, especially while they fight it out. And she's trying to stop him from essentially doing business in New York. But let me play another soundbite from President Trump's interview with Sean Hannity, in which he explains how he dealt with the big banks when he was trying to get loans for his organization. Molly, this gets to what most of the media, I think, are kind of brushing off or ignoring, which is there are no victims here, victims in quotes, except for the major banks who are not claiming that they were defrauded or that they lost money. This is not a case where, poor widows were wiped out because of anything that Trump did in terms of the valuations. It's about these major banks.
I'm sorry, it's very hard to even take this civil suit seriously because everyone serious understands that this is just a political attack on the president. But if you were to take it seriously, then you would have to actually go after pretty much everybody in New York City for the same type of valuations, the same type of issues. And again, this gets to these two standards of justice that we have in this country. And it's whether you're talking about the New York Attorney General or Biden's Department of Justice, or even that Texas sheriff who said that he wasn't sure what law was broken when DeSantis sent the illegal immigrants to Martha's Vineyard, but he was going to figure out some way to go after him. That is a direct attack on our country's founding principles on rule of law. And we cannot sustain two standards of justice much longer.
Well, Leslie, whether it's the big banks or not, it doesn't give Trump the right to submit fraudulent valuations. But, I've covered some of these. These are complicated matters. Real estate companies always try to make their balance sheet look better within the confines of the law. And this could drag on, as I said. And the pundits on your side are saying Trump will finally be held accountable. But maybe not.
I don't think this holds him accountable necessarily. I would agree with Molly, there are other people doing this. Here's the difference, and I think we all know this. If people are committing crimes like this, allegedly, and they're really quiet about it, nobody notices, right? But if you're standing there constantly on national television and at rallies lying, and you're putting the spotlight and the cameras are rolling, you're bringing attention to yourself. And we've seen that historically with other individuals who have been prosecuted because, you know, they were, as my teenage daughter would say, a pick-me person. Pick me, pick me. And when you bring that attention to yourself, that gets the attention of people like the Attorney General in New York, for example.
I think the argument there is that because corporate media and other Democrats despise and are filled with hatred toward President Trump, that therefore he's bringing this on himself to have two standards of justice. And again, in this country, we just can't be that way. We need to be we need to be ruled by law and not men. And that is something we have moved so far away from, and it could crash the entire republic.
Not men or women. Leslie, you want to respond to that?
You know, I'm old enough to remember back when a guy named William Jefferson Clinton was president, and there were so many gates, more gates than I had when my kids were toddlers in the house. There was Nanny Gate, there was Travel Gate, there was Whitewater Gate. And you know what? He wasn't really guilty of anything. But when the Republicans stood up there and had their legal people standing up there, Bill Clinton seemed to be found guilty before he was proven innocent.
Well, so
I would say this has happened for a long time.
Setting the record completely straight, I am compelled to mention that Bill Clinton was impeached for questions about his testimony for a grand jury, whether he was lying, which he basically was, about Monica Lewinsky. But that's, of course, not how the Whitewater probe
That
started.
wasn't a gate, though. Monica Lewinsky wasn't a gate.
Okay,
no,
well,
wasn't one of the gates.
The media also affixed gate to an awful lot of investigations. So in the Justice Department case, Donald Trump's comment to Hannity about declassifying documents, even by thinking about it, is drawing a lot of jokes about magic powers. Even top Republicans are saying, no, it's a process. You have to tell other officials, Molly.
Well, in fact, constitutionally speaking, the president is the top classification and declassification authority. So it is true, and this is actually speaking of Bill Clinton, this was something that Judge Amy Berman Jackson resolved when Bill Clinton was keeping classified information in a sock drawer. That went to that was a court case that was resolved in Bill Clinton's favor. And so again, we have these two standards of justice with presidents in the recent past where some presidents are treated differently than others, and that can't happen. This entire NARA-type paperwork dispute never should have gotten to the level it is. And we have a lot of irresponsibility from Biden's Department of Justice in how they're handling something. This is a really important issue, and we have an FBI and Department of Justice that have lost credibility, who have lied in order to secure search warrants on this president. They should be extremely careful in what they're doing. And something like a paperwork dispute or a classification dispute should be handled with much more sensitivity, like they have in the past with other presidents.
Just to be clear, you buy the notion that he can declassify documents even by thinking about it? Because you got Republicans saying, no, you got to tell somebody else, so other agencies, particularly intelligence agencies, would know.
I'm saying he's the top classification and declassification authority. It is not subject to review by anyone else when the president classifies or declassifies something. And how could it be? I mean, he is the top constitutional officer to handle this.
Well, again, Republicans say there's a process. Leslie, I want to get you in on that. But also, how important is the latest on the Justice Department appealing, getting a three-judge panel of the 11th Circuit in Atlanta, 2 Trump appointees and 1 appointed by Obama, which has the DOJ probe back in action, limiting the special master's review?
Well, to what we're speaking of, you basically have 2 Trump appointees and 1 Obama appointee in the 11th Circuit, saying, there is no evidence that these records were declassified. So this is a win for the Justice Department, as you rightly stated, Howie, because this continues. And I want to quote from the Presidential Records Act, okay? Because this speaks specifically to how a president classifies or declassifies information. One, you have to identify the specific documents, even if that's verbal. And then 2, they have to be recorded. And the reason for that is when you have records that are classified and declassified, they are physically handled in a different way by the handlers. So they have to be documented on those records, on those documents, which is declassified and which isn't.
All right. Now,
so
remember I came
you can't do it through osmosis.
Remember I came on the air a few weeks ago and I said, Fox doesn't have any kind of ban against Donald Trump coming on? Obviously not. The former president comes on if he thinks it's in his interest to do so. Now ahead, coverage of Ron DeSantis now facing a lawsuit over the Martha's Vineyard migrants. But when we come back, Joe Biden declares on 60 Minutes that the pandemic is over, and the media pushing back. President Biden said a number of things on 60 Minutes that caused journalists and his own advisors to scramble, especially about the coronavirus. Molly, even medical correspondents on the left-leaning networks had to say, well, no, the pandemic isn't over.
Well, I don't think that's quite... If you listen to the full remarks that President Biden said, he said, of course, it's still around. We still have these things happening, but the pandemic itself is over. That's true in the same way that it's true that we still have influenza around, but that doesn't mean that you still have pandemic response to it. This is where there's a problem because he is having pandemic type response. He just has been issuing executive orders and justifying actions on the basis of a pandemic that he himself says is over.
Well, I'll come back to that, but Leslie, yeah, Biden qualified his remarks, no question about it, but he's been in politics forever, and he knew the pandemic is over would be the headline in this midterm campaign season, and that the media would run with it.
Absolutely. You mean that old man with dementia smarter than we think, Howard? Sorry, I couldn't help myself. Look, if you look, you have to ask whose definition of pandemic, okay? So when we look to Merriam-Webster for the definition, what's the definition of what isn't a pandemic? And it states, a widespread endemic disease with a stable number of infected individuals is not a pandemic. The deaths are 10%. People have vaccinations, people have boosters, people have choices. Borders to other countries and to our country to come and go legally are open. In addition to that, businesses are not getting, PPP loans, and 10% of individuals are now 10% of the numbers of deaths that we have. In other words, we have 90% more people surviving. So I think it does depend on whose definition. Obviously, the World Health Organization disagrees, and some people within my own party disagree with that statement.
Right.
But I think most people don't feel they're living. I don't feel personally that I'm living under a pandemic as I was when I was standing in line at a grocery store wearing a mask and terrified as to what was coming.
Well, at the moment, unfortunately, more than 400 Americans a day are being killed because of COVID or COVID-related. But Molly, as you alluded to, if the White House officially says, okay, the pandemic's over, the administration loses a whole lot of emergency powers that has enabled the president to do a bunch of things.
And that's where the media should definitely be critiquing what was said by President Biden. But I think the media have done a very poor job of looking into some of these issues because they themselves did so much during this entire pandemic to hype the COVID threat much more than it actually was. It's a very bad thing. Nobody wants to get it, but they hyped it so much more. We had a response to the pandemic that has really done a lot to damage the country, whether that was shutting down schools, whether that was shutting down the economy, whether that is the continued unconstitutional actions being taken by a president on the basis of a pandemic, and our media are very poorly suited to handle that.
So, Leslie, is this another instance where the president says one thing like, we will defend Taiwan, which he also told Scott Pelley, and the aides rush out and say, well, Biden didn't misspeak, but the policy hasn't changed at all, which creates a little bit of cognitive dissonance.
I don't think is in today's world of politics, especially in the United States. We've seen this happen, with Trump. We've seen it happen with Obama, and now with President Biden, where the president has one opinion and says so, and then the staff goes, well, that's very nice that the president feels that way, but policy is going to remain. I don't think that most voters hang on that because most voters aren't voting based on Taiwan or even based on a pandemic or COVID nowadays when you look at the data.
Very quickly.
Well, the problem with this walkback that you're getting from the White House is that it's frequently anonymously sourced, and we need to know when the White House disagrees with the president, first of all, who's in charge, but also they shouldn't just allow an anonymous walkback.
Okay, well, sometimes it's anonymous, sometimes not. Molly Hemingway, Leslie Marshall, thanks so much.